only a phenomenalist. We can only talk about how the self appears, not what the self is. Well, I think that which he develops right at the end of the of Book 2 of the treatise, I think that is perhaps one of the clearest examples of how this empiricist criterion of meaning works. What else do we have to refer to empirically in talking about the self? You see. Well, as you probably are aware, it's this empiricist criterion of meaning which was adopted and updated by 20th century logical empiricists. And we'll be running into it again when we get to A.J. Ayer and his book, Language, Truth and Logic, which we'll be reading on in the spring sometime. To be in Ayer when April is here. You know, it'll be just about that time when some of us would say, oh, to be in England now that April's here, it'll be A.J. Ayer instead. And he, after all, is English. So, all right, any comments there about Locke and how he goes, I take it back, Hume and how he goes beyond Locke? Okay. All right, now, still with his theory of ideas, how does he compare with Berkeley? How does he compare with Berkeley? Well, I think the first observation is an obvious one, that he agrees with Berkeley's nominalism. He agrees with Berkeley's nominalism. That's obvious, isn't it? That if we're going to be strictly empiricists, tracing everything back to impressions, then there are no empirical impressions of abstract entities or of abstract ideas. Our ideas are all of them about particular qualities that are seen or felt. And words only become general names by customary usage that uses them indiscriminately between similar particulars. We associate the particulars by virtue of their commonalities and use one word to refer to them all. But we never abstract any concept of a universal essence. So he agrees with Berkeley in that regard, and that attitude of Hume's towards abstract ideas comes out in his discussion of space and time, which is in part 2 of the treatise. It's not in the inquiry. He maintains that we have no empirical idea, because no ultimate impression, of infinite space or infinite time. And when people thought of, when people like some of the pre-Socratics talk of infinite divisibility of particles of matter, on and on and on, well, if we have no concept of infinity, we can't think with any clear idea of infinite divisibility. And so those notions associated with traditional discussion are out. All we can think of is finite spatial relations and temporal relations. Just that. There is no abstract idea of space, no abstract idea of time, no abstract idea of substance, only complex ideas of particular substances as a collection of simple ideas. That's all. No idea of existence, only of particulars that we think, as we say, exist. But you don't have a conception of existence. No impressions of existence. You get impressions that have qualities of their own. Existence is not a quality of an idea. And that is going to be significant when we get to Immanuel Kant, and he talks of the ontological argument, you see, The idea of a perfect being such that it must necessarily exist. Well, if existence is not a concept, you cannot predicate it of anything. It's not a proper predicate, as Kant says. And so there's no proof there in an ontological proof. Okay. So by the time you get through that orientation to Hume's modified theory of ideas, you can see pretty well where he's going. And I think it really begins to seem as if the rest is simply a mopping up operation. At least the rest of what he's doing about knowledge and belief and metaphysical and theological topics. Okay. Notice that his basic question is not, can you prove such and such, but what in experience are you talking about? The basic question is one of meaningfulness, empirical meaning, rather than truth. Unless you know what empirically is being referred to, how can you check the truth of a statement? Okay. Well, question, comment there. Yeah.
It seems to me that the empiricist criterion of meaning leads naturally to a nominalism for someone who's an empiricist, because then you can't have the idea that words are actual ideas.
Did you get that, hear that question, John? It seems that the empiricist criterion of meaning leads naturally, I think you mean logically, to nominalism.
Well, yeah, as long as you're maintaining an empiricist view.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're completely right.
Well, my question then actually is, did the attack, or I'm wondering, when did the idea that words are ideas come about? Did that not come about until Wittgenstein challenged this? Or
when did it come out that words are ideas?
Or representing
something other than...
Yeah, representing something other than...
Yeah, well, Wittgenstein is also, I think, a nominalist in the sense of repudiating abstract ideas. John Locke, of course, is an empiricist who's not a nominalist. And perhaps your question is whether there are other than empiricists, whether there are other empiricists in addition to Locke who are not nominalists. Get it? What you may be getting at is this. Was Locke mistaken about the logical compatibility of empiricism and conceptualism? Does an empiricist always have to be a nominalist? Does it necessarily follow?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it does with the empirical criterion of meaning. I guess I'm wondering, when was this empirical criterion of meaning finally challenged so that it might open up more logical grounds for empiricists to be?
Well, it was challenged in the, or somewhat in the 40s, but challenged in the 50s, and by the 60s it was pretty well passé, 1960s. But its challenge was not so much from the standpoint of conceptualists as rather from those who claimed that the empiricist with the empiricist criterion of meaning is not being empirical enough about the diversity of language. You see? And that, in a way, was Wittgenstein's point. He would say that language plays other games than simply the game of naming, pointing, denoting, referring. You see? And what's involved in that is the recognition that language doesn't just consist of isolated words, nor of syntactical structures, but language is a social function, a cultural activity, a means by which in the culture we do all sorts of things, in the language culture, you see. So the oversimplification there. Yeah. So that I think that criticism is pertinent. There was another line of criticism which I think is also very pertinent. The way the logical positivists stated the criterion, it was to this effect that any factual statement, in order to have empirical meaning, must in principle at least be empirically verifiable. Now, is that a factual statement? If so, is it empirically verifiable? You know, it becomes obvious that it's not an empirical statement, it's not a factual statement that's empirically verifiable. And so the positivists had to back up and say, no, this is a methodological stipulation on our part. And in saying that, they've really shifted ground and said we are going to act as if empirical reference is the only kind of meaning. Yes. No, I think Locke's position is defensible if we recognize that the carriers of abstract ideas are not mental images. Okay? Locke seems to think, with his notion of a clear and distinct idea, that what we carry in our minds is mental images of something. An image of the blueness of your shirt, or whatever, you see. No, when it comes to thinking abstractly, we're not imaging particular qualities. We're thinking verbally, you see. And it's words which are the vehicles of non-empirical thinking, thinking in abstraction from. So that, if you want to use the phrase, one of the games that language plays is abstract thinking, which is most noticeable in the way in which mathematics works, or a dictionary works, you see. Though that kind of abstract thinking, where the statements are not factual statements but analytic statements, is not the only one, I think. I think poetry is another kind of abstract thinking, where the words of the poet conjure up whole general ideas without picturing particulars, sometimes by picturing a particular, but other times just the word itself gains symbolic significance, symbolism. Well, that's obviously a crucial question. And when this business came up in the 20th century, and we'll talk about that when we get to it, two of the crucial issues involved were, what does this do to moral language, and what does it do to religious language?